The wind on Lake Superior does not howl. It screams. It is a physical weight, a wall of pressurized air that hunts for gaps in your clothing and pulls the heat out of your blood before you even register the drop in temperature. I stood on the concrete apron of the crib, 24 miles from the nearest coastline, and watched the gray water hammer against the steel caisson below. The spray froze in midair, landing as hard grit on my jacket. My name is Elias Vance, and I am a systems integrator for the Great Lakes Navigation Authority. My job, on paper, is to ensure that the automated beacons and foghorns on offshore lights keep running so that ore freighters do not crack their hulls on the shoals. In reality, my job is to be a janitor for ghosts. These towers were built in the 19th century for keepers who brought their families out here, burned kerosene, and polished brass. Now, they are just hollow tubes of iron and concrete, filled with automated relays, backup diesel generators, and silence. I arrived at the Granite Island Light 2 hours ago. My boat, a 26-foot aluminum hull work skiff with twin Yamaha outboards, was tied off to the iron cleats on the lee side of the crib. The water was choppy, running 3-foot swells that slapped the aluminum hull against the concrete bumpers with a rhythmic, hollow thud. I checked the lines one last time. I used a double bowline on the forward cleat and a spring line running aft to keep the engines clear of the wall. The tie-up had to be perfect. Out here, if your boat drifts, you do not swim after it. You watch it go, and then you die of exposure 3 days later. The tower rose 80 feet above me, a tapering cone of riveted steel plates painted a white that had long ago faded to the color of dirty bone. It sat on a massive concrete square, the crib, that plunged 50 feet down to the bedrock of the lake. It was an island of engineering in a freshwater ocean. I hauled my tool bag and the replacement control module up the external ladder. The rungs were coated in a thin layer of verglas, clear ice formed by the freezing spray. I moved with the deliberate, 3-point contact rhythm that keeps you alive in this trade. Left hand, verify grip. Right foot, verify traction. Shift weight. Repeat. The wind tried to peel me off the steel, gusting up to 40 knots, but gravity and fear are excellent anchors. The entry door was a heavy steel slab set into the base of the tower, secured by a wheel-actuated dogging system. It had not been opened in 6 months. I had to use a cheater bar, a 2-foot length of steel pipe I carried for leverage, to crack the wheel loose. The mechanism groaned, a sound of dry metal shearing against dry metal, before the dogs retracted. I pushed the door inward. The air that rushed out smelled of diesel, stagnant oil, and the slow decay of 100-year-old lead paint. Inside, the silence was absolute. The walls were 2 feet of brick lined with steel, a barrier that cut the screaming wind down to a dull, distant vibration. I clicked on my headlamp. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the spiral iron staircase that wound up the center of the shaft. My work order was standard. Swap out a failing PLC, a programmable logic controller that managed the charging cycle for the battery bank. The old unit was throwing voltage irregularities, causing the backup generator to short cycle. It was a simple swap. Disconnect the negative leads, label the signal wires, unbolt the DIN rail mount, snap the new unit in, terminate the connections, and test. An hour of work, tops. Then I'd get back in the boat, punch through the chop to Marquette, and be eating a burger by sunset. I climbed to the watchroom, the level just below the lantern deck. This was the brain of the lighthouse. A rack of gray industrial cabinets hummed against the curved wall. I set my bag down on the steel grating of the floor. I did not rush. Rushing leads to stripped threads and dropped screws, and if you drop a screw through the grating here, It falls 60 feet into the dark, oily sump of the basement. I opened the main cabinet. The smell of ozone and warm electronics filled the small space. I pulled my multimeter from the bag, a Fluke 87V, the only meter I trusted. I set the dial to DC voltage and probed the terminals on the old PLC. 26. 4 volts. Floating high. The logic inputs were flickering. The unit was definitely cooked. I isolated the power. The hum of the inverter died, leaving only the wind outside. I pulled my terminal screwdriver, a precision Vera with a laser-etched tip, and began backing out the set screws on the terminal block. I worked methodically. Loosen, pull the wire, wrap a piece of white electrical tape around it, mark the number with a Sharpie. 24 volts positive. Common ground. Relay output 1. I was halfway through the signal wires when the radio on my hip crackled. It was a Motorola commercial unit, tuned to the authorities' dispatch frequency. Usually it was dead quiet this far out, save for the occasional static burst from a storm front. Unable to contain. Sector 4 is gone. Do not attempt to... The voice was distorted, clipped by poor signal propagation, but the tone was wrong. Dispatchers are bored people. They sound like they are reading a menu. This voice was an octave too high, breathless, punching the words out in a staccato rhythm of panic. I stopped turning the screwdriver. I reached down and turned the volume knob to max. Repeat. The blockade at the bridge has failed. Mackinac is overrun. All units, seek immediate... Holy God. They're in the water. They're in the... Static swallowed the voice. Then a sharp, digital squeal, followed by the open mic sound of wind and distant, wet, tearing noises. Then nothing. I stood there for a long time, the small screwdriver heavy in my hand. My heart rate had not spiked yet. My brain was trying to categorize the data. Blockade. Overrun. Sector 4. These were not navigation terms. This sounded like military traffic, but on a civilian maintenance band. I walked over to the porthole on the west side of the watchroom. The glass was an inch thick, distorted by age and salt. I unlatched the brass dogs and swung the heavy circle of glass inward. The cold hit me like a physical slap. I raised my binoculars. Steiner's. 7x50, standard issue. I focused on the shoreline to the south. It was 24 miles away, usually just a dark smudge on the horizon. Today, it was distinct. Smoke. Not the white steam of the paper mills or the gray exhaust of the ore docks. This was black, oily smoke, rising in thick columns that merged into a low, hanging pall over where the city of Marquette should be. I scanned east. More smoke. It looked like the entire Upper Peninsula was burning. I panned the glass down to the water. The shipping lanes were usually empty this time of year, save for the 1,000-footers making their last runs before the ice locks set in. 3 miles out, I saw a freighter. It was the Edmund Fitzgerald class, a massive bulk carrier. It was dead in the water, drifting broadside to the waves. No running lights, no radar rotation. As I watched, the swells broke over its midsection. It was listing, heavy to the bow. I lowered the binoculars. My breath plumed white in the freezing air of the open porthole. The cold was clarifying. I was not looking at a forest fire. I was not looking at a localized riot. The radio traffic and the smoke painted a picture of systemic collapse. I looked down at the PLC on the cabinet shelf. The wires were splayed out like severed nerves. If I did not finish the install, the light would not run. If the light did not run, the batteries would drain, and the heat trace on the fuel lines would fail. Then the diesel in the basement tanks would gel, and this tower would freeze into a tomb. I closed the porthole and tightened the dogs until the seal compressed. I went back to the cabinet. My hands were shaking slightly now, a fine tremor in the fingers. I forced them to stop by gripping the screwdriver until my knuckles turned white. Finish the job. I inserted the new PLC into the DIN rail. Click. I began terminating the wires. Red to terminal 1, black to terminal 2, signal wire 3 to input 4. I tightened each screw with precise torque, checking the bite by tugging the wire gently. I did not think about the smoke. I thought about the copper contact patch. I thought about the continuity. When the last wire was seated, I flipped the breaker. The new unit booted up. A row of green LEDs blinked on, cascading from left to right. Solid green on run. Solid green on battery OK. The inverter hummed back to life. The system was stable. I packed my tools. Every wrench back in its slot. Every cut-off of wire tailored into the trash pouch. Order was the only thing I had left. I picked up the bag and headed down the spiral stairs. The boots rang on the iron steps. Clang, clang, clang. It sounded like a bell tolling inside a crypt. When I reached the bottom level, I did not open the heavy door immediately. I put my ear against the cold steel. The wind was louder now, a roaring vibration that shook the rivets. The storm that had been threatening all morning had arrived. I cracked the wheel. The wind ripped the door out of my hand, slamming it against the stop with a crash that vibrated through my teeth. The world outside was white chaos. The waves had grown to 6, maybe 8 feet. They were smashing against the crib, sending sheets of freezing water clear over the top of the apron. I looked toward the lee side, where I had tied the boat. The aluminum work skiff was gone. My stomach dropped, a sensation of weightlessness that had nothing to do with gravity. I clipped my safety line to the railing and fought my way to the edge of the crib, shielding my eyes against the stinging sleet. I saw the bowline. It was still tied to the cleat. The rope had not come untied. It had snapped. The sheer force of the surge combined with the chafe against the concrete had sawed through 3/4-inch braided nylon. I scanned the gray tumult of the lake. I spotted the boat about 200 yards downwind. It was capsized, the twin Yamahas pointing at the sky like dead limbs. As I watched, a massive roller picked it up and smashed it down onto a submerged shoal of rock. The hull crumpled. I stood there for a long minute, watching my ride home disintegrate. The cold was seeping through my Carhartt jacket, finding the sweat on my back. I was not stranded. Stranded implies you are stuck somewhere while the rest of the world goes on. I was exiled. I turned back to the tower. The wind was trying to push me off the concrete, trying to slide me into the freezing wash. I lowered my center of gravity and crab-walked back to the door. Getting the steel door closed against the wind was a battle of leverage. I had to brace my boot against the frame and pull with everything I had, feeling the muscles in my back scream. Inch by inch, the steel plate fought the air pressure. Finally, the latch caught. I spun the wheel, driving the dogs deep into the frame. Clunk, clunk, clunk. Sealed. I was breathing hard, my breath fogging the air in the entryway. I slid down the wall and sat on the cold floor, resting my head against the iron. I took stock. I was on Granite Island Light, a crib lighthouse built in 1912. Inventory. My tool bag, hand tools, multimeter, spare wire, electrical tape. My lunch cooler, 1 thermos of coffee, now lukewarm, 2 ham sandwiches, an apple, a bag of chips. The tower supplies. I stood up. I needed to know exactly what the tower held. The maintenance logs were digital, but I knew the physical reality was often different. I went down the narrow hatch in the floor to the basement level. This was the belly of the beast. It was dark, smelling of diesel number 2 and damp concrete. I shined my headlamp around. 3 fuel tanks, massive riveted iron vessels. I checked the sight glass on the main tank. 3/4 full. That was about 2,000 gallons, enough to run the generator for a year if I was careful. Fresh water? No. These lights used to have cisterns to collect rainwater from the roof, but they were decommissioned decades ago when the keepers left. The pipes were cut and capped. There was no running water. I found the emergency locker, a red metal cabinet bolted to the wall. I cut the zip tie seal with my side cutters. Inside, a first aid kit, expired 2015. A flare gun with 3 shells. 2 wool blankets, moth-eaten. A box of MREs, meals ready to eat, dating back to the early 2000s. I shook the box. Maybe 12 meals. A 5-gallon jug of distilled water used for topping off the batteries. That was it. 2,000 gallons of fuel. 12 meals. 5 gallons of water. And the lake, the largest freshwater reservoir in the world, directly outside the walls. But getting to it meant opening that door and facing the ice-glazed concrete apron where a slip meant death. And drinking it raw meant ingesting whatever biological nightmare was washing off the mainland. I climbed back up the spiral stairs, past the entry level, past the battery room, past the watch room, all the way to the lantern deck. The lantern room was the crown of the tower, a glass polygon protecting the optic. The old Fresnel lens was gone, replaced by a modern VRB25 LED beacon. It was a sterile, rotating puck of light. I stood next to the beacon as the sun began to set. The storm was intensifying. The glass panes rattled in their bronze frames. To the south, the glow on the horizon was brighter now. The fires in Marquette had grown. I could see the orange pulse reflecting off the low cloud deck. It looked like the gates of hell had opened up in Michigan. I pulled my phone out. No signal. I tried the VHF radio again. Just static, and occasionally that same terrible, wet screaming sound, like a transmission left open in a room where bad things were happening. I turned the radio off. The silence returned, underlined by the hum of the beacon's motor. I was a systems engineer. My life was defined by inputs, processes, and outputs. Input: the world has ended. Input: I am trapped on a rock in a freezing lake. Input: I have limited calories and hydration. Output: survival. I looked at the glass walls. They were single pane. The cold was radiating off them. If the generator failed, I would freeze to death in this room in 6 hours. I needed to consolidate. I went back down to the watch room. It was smaller, easier to heat. The equipment racks generated a constant, low-grade warmth. This would be my home. I took the 2 wool blankets from the basement and brought them up. I laid one on the steel grating floor. I rolled my jacket into a pillow. My stomach growled. I opened my cooler and ate half of one ham sandwich. I chewed slowly, making it last. I drank a single mouthful of coffee. Then I began the work. I could not just sit. Sitting is waiting to die. I took my linesman pliers and a roll of electrical tape. I went to the door frame of the watch room. There was a gap at the bottom where the cold draft from the stairs drifted in. I used the tape to seal it, layer by layer, creating a makeshift gasket. I checked the ventilation louvers on the battery bank. They were stuck open. I used a wrench to force them partially closed, balancing the need for hydrogen venting with the need to keep heat in. I inventoried my pockets. A Leatherman Wave multi-tool, a Bic lighter, a folding pocket knife, Kershaw blur, a small LED flashlight. 7 screws I had salvaged from the old PLC install. I placed the 7 screws in a neat row on top of the gray cabinet. They were assets now. Metal. Fasteners. Irreplaceable. Night fell completely. The beam of the lighthouse swept the room every 6 seconds. Flash. Dark. Flash. Dark. I sat on the wool blanket, my back against the warm metal of the inverter cabinet. I could feel the tower vibrating. It was not a rigid structure. It was designed to flex. When the big waves hit the crib 80 feet down, the impact traveled up through the masonry and steel, manifesting as a shudder that you felt in your spine. Thud. Shudder. Thud. Shudder. It was the heartbeat of the lake. I closed my eyes, but I did not sleep. I listened to the wind screaming around the lantern deck above. I visualized the cross-section of the tower. I calculated the thermal mass of the brick lining. I estimated the BTUs in the diesel tank. I was alone. The boat was gone. The mainland was burning. But the light was running. The voltage was stable at 27.2 volts. The heartbeat of the tower was strong. "Okay," I whispered to the empty room. My voice sounded flat, swallowed by the steel. I was not a soldier. I was not a survivalist. I was a guy who knew how to make machines work. I looked at the 5-gallon jug of distilled water I had brought up from the basement. It was sitting on the floor next to me. Problem 1. Water. I had 5 gallons. A human needs half a gallon a day to maintain kidney function in the cold. 10 days. But I had the lake. I just needed a way to bring the water up 80 feet without exposing myself to the waves, and a way to purify it without wasting fuel boiling it. I looked at the conduit runs along the wall. Galvanized steel pipe. I looked at the ventilation shaft that ran from the basement to the roof. My mind started drifting into schematics. A pump. I did not have a pump. Wait. The diesel transfer pump in the basement. It was a 12-volt positive displacement gear pump. If I could pull it, clean it of diesel residue. No, the hydrocarbons would be embedded in the seals. I could not drink that. Gravity. I needed gravity. Or pressure. I fell asleep drafting a blueprint in my head, dreaming of pipe threads and check valves, while the world burned 24 miles away. The next morning, the sun did not rise. The sky just turned from black to a bruised purple. The storm had not broken. If anything, it was worse. I stood at the porthole, eating the second half of my sandwich. I watched the waves. They were gray mountains, rolling in sets of 3. Something floated past the crib. It was caught in the eddy current on the lee side, swirling in the foam. It was a body. It was wearing a bright orange life vest. The face was submerged, but the limbs were moving with the water in a way that looked wrong. Loose. Broken. It bumped against the concrete crib. Thud. I stopped chewing. The body spun slowly. One arm flailed up, caught by a wave. The hand was missing. Not severed clean, but gone. ends of radius and ulna exposed. Then the head turned. It was not dead. The eyes were white cataracts. The mouth was opening and closing, biting at the freezing water, biting at the concrete. It clawed at the slick wall of the crib, fingers slipping on the ice. It was trying to climb. It was in water that was 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Human physiology shuts down in minutes at that temperature. Muscles seize. The heart goes into arrhythmia. This thing was thrashing with the energy of a machine. I watched it for 10 minutes. It did not slow down. It did not drown. It just kept scratching at the vertical concrete, driven by a biological imperative that ignored thermodynamics. Eventually, a large wave caught it and smashed it against the corner of the crib. I heard the crack of bone even through the glass. It went limp for a second, then started thrashing again, washing away into the gray swells. I turned away from the window. I looked at the heavy steel door at the bottom of the stairs. I had locked it. I had dogged it down, but I had not deadbolted it. And the wheel was on the inside. But could something turn a wheel from the outside? No. But what if they did not need to use the door? I thought about the ventilation shaft. It was a 12-inch square duct that opened at the base of the tower to let fresh air into the diesel engines. It was covered by a wire mesh. Rat wire. Thin gauge. If that thing in the water could ignore the cold, if it could climb. I grabbed my tool bag. I grabbed the cheater bar. I ran down the stairs, skipping every other step, the ringing of my boots sounding like an alarm. I reached the basement. The diesel smell was strong. I shined my light at the intake vent on the far wall. The mesh was rusted. It was old. And it was vibrating. Not from the wind. Something was in the duct. I did not scream. I did not freeze. I grabbed the heaviest wrench I had, a 24-inch adjustable crescent wrench, a 4-pound lump of drop-forged steel. I stood by the vent, listening to the wet, scraping sound of something dragging itself up the metal tube. I was not a janitor anymore. I was the keeper. And nothing was getting inside my tower. The sound in the vent was not the wet slap of a hand or the scratching of a fingernail. It was a scramble. A frantic, scurrying rhythm of claws on galvanized sheet metal. I stood in the basement gloom, the 24-inch crescent wrench raised above my shoulder like a club. My breath misted in the beam of the headlamp. The air intake duct was a 12-inch square tunnel running horizontally through the concrete crib wall, turning 90 degrees upward to surface near the apron. The wire mesh covering the interior opening was vibrating violently. Scritch, scritch, thump. It was small. Too small to be a man. Too small to be one of them. The mesh bulged. A rusted corner gave way. A dark shape erupted from the duct, landing on the concrete floor with a wet smack. It did not pause. It hissed, a high, needle-sharp sound, and launched itself toward the dark warmth of the generator block. I swung the wrench. It was a reflex, a geometric intercept calculated by a brain flooded with adrenaline. The heavy steel jaw caught the animal in midair. There was a sickening crunch, a transfer of kinetic energy that traveled up my arm and into my shoulder. The shape hit the wall and slid down, twitching. I kept the light on it. It was a mink. Its fur was matted with oil and ice, its teeth bared in a rictus of final aggression. It had climbed the vertical exterior wall, squeezed through the rusted exterior louvers, and crawled 20 feet through a freezing pipe just to find heat. I lowered the wrench. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a chaotic rhythm that annoyed me. It was a waste of calories. I looked at the vent. The mink was not the problem. The mink was a warning. If a 3-pound weasel could breach the perimeter, the airflow intake was a fatal vulnerability. The viral agents, or whatever biological imperative drove the infected, might not be airborne, but the infected themselves were fluid. They did not think. They flowed. They pressed into gaps. If a child-sized one tried that vent, they would get stuck, die, and block the airflow. If the airflow stopped, the generator died. If the generator died, the heat trace failed. Then the fuel gelled, and I froze. I grabbed the dead mink by the tail. I did not want to touch it, but I could not leave rotting organic matter in my workspace. I carried it up the spiral stairs, past the battery room, to the gallery deck door. I cracked the seal, shoved the carcass into the howling wind, and slammed the door. The lake would take it. I went back down to the basement. I needed to secure the intake without choking the engine. The logic of survival is binary. A system is either secure or it has failed. There is no good enough. I walked to the scrap pile in the corner of the basement, the boneyard where decades of lazy technicians had left their trash. Old filters, bent conduit, rusted brackets. I dug through the pile until I found a section of expanded steel grating. It was heavy, diamond-patterned steel, thick enough to walk on. It had been part of a catwalk once. I measured the intake opening, 12 by 12 inches. I marked the steel with a piece of soapstone. I clamped the grating to the workbench vise. Cutting steel by hand is a lesson in patience. I used a hacksaw with a bimetal blade, applying steady, rhythmic pressure on the push stroke, easing off on the return. Rasps, rasps, rasps. The sound filled the concrete chamber. It took me 40 minutes to cut a 14-inch square. My shoulder burned, a dull ache that I welcomed. Pain is data. It means you are still metabolic. I drilled 4 holes into the concrete wall around the vent using a masonry bit and a hand-crank drill I found in the bottom of the tool chest. The battery drills were dead, and I was not wasting generator fuel to charge them yet. Each hole took 10 minutes of grinding pressure. I set lead masonry anchors into the holes. I placed the heavy steel grate over the flimsy wire mesh. I threaded 4 half-inch lag bolts through the grate and into the anchors. I tightened them with a ratchet until the steel bit into the concrete. Click, click. Solid. I gave the grate a kick. It did not vibrate. You could drive a truck into that vent and it would not pass. The airflow remained unrestricted, but the physical path was now barred by 1/4-inch plate steel. I wiped the sweat from my forehead. 1 hole plugged, but the exertion had triggered a new alarm. My mouth was dry. My tongue felt like sandpaper. Thirst. I checked my watch. I had not drunk water in 12 hours. I had the 5-gallon jug of distilled water, but that was a finite resource. Once it was gone, I was dead. I looked at the diesel generator. It was a Lister Petter 3-cylinder engine, a reliable British workhorse painted a dark, industrial green. It was currently silent. I had a lake full of water outside, but it was biological poison. The Great Lakes are cold, which preserves pathogens, and with the mainland burning, the runoff would be toxic. I needed a refinery. I sat on an overturned bucket and stared at the engine. An engine is just an air pump that makes heat. Only about 30% of the energy in diesel fuel becomes rotational force. The rest is waste heat, ejected through the radiator and the exhaust. Heat is energy. Energy can break bonds. Energy can turn dirty water into pure steam. I stood up. I was not going to boil water in a pot like a camper. I was going to build a continuous flow distillation loop integrated into the generator's thermal cycle. I moved to the store's locker, a rusted cabinet near the fuel tanks. I pulled everything out, laying the components on the concrete floor to assess my inventory. One coil of 3/8-inch soft copper tubing, approximately 20 feet, left over from a defunct AC install. A box of brass compression fittings. A MAP gas torch, yellow bottle, half full. Flux paste and a spool of lead-free silver solder. A heavy-duty stainless steel stockpot, 5 gallons, likely used by a keeper decades ago for laundry or soup. A roll of aluminum foil tape. A pile of random galvanized pipe nipples and elbows. The plan formed in my mind. A flash boiler. The exhaust manifold of the Lister Petter was a cast iron log that ran along the side of the engine block. When running under load, it would reach temperatures north of 600 degrees Fahrenheit. If I wrapped copper tubing around that manifold, water pumped through it would flash to steam instantly. But that was dangerous. Steam expansion in a confined tube creates a bomb. Better approach. A pot still, heated by the manifold, with a gravity condenser. The fabrication. I started with the condenser coil. Distillation relies on surface area. I needed to take the 20 feet of copper tubing and turn it into a tight spiral that would fit inside a cooling vessel. I found a discarded CO2 fire extinguisher cylinder in the scrap pile. It was about 6 inches in diameter, perfect for a mandrel. I clamped the cylinder in the vise. I took the end of the copper tubing and secured it. Then, the physical labor. I pulled the copper around the cylinder, keeping the tension high to prevent the tube from kinking. Pull, wrap, slide. Pull, wrap, slide. The copper fought me, work hardening as I bent it, but I kept the spacing even. I made 12 tight loops. When I slid the coil off the cylinder, it was a beautiful, gleaming spring. Next, the boiler. The stainless stock pot. I needed a lid that sealed hermetically. The pot had a loose-fitting cover. Not good enough. I took the lid and drilled a 1/2-inch hole in the center. I inserted a brass bulkhead fitting, tightening the nut down on a neoprene washer I cut from an old mousepad. This would be the steam outlet. To seal the lid to the pot, I could not use rubber. The heat would melt it. I made a gasket from a sheet of high-temp gasket material I found in the engine spare parts kit, usually used for head gaskets. I cut a ring, placed it on the rim, and used 6 C-clamps to secure the lid. Now, the integration. I needed to mount this pot on the engine. The exhaust manifold had a heat shield, a perforated steel cover. I removed it. The cast iron underneath was rusted and rough. I could not just sit the pot on the round manifold. I needed a thermal bridge. I found a piece of aluminum channel in the boneyard. Aluminum conducts heat beautifully. I cut a 12-inch section and hammered it until it roughly conformed to the curve of the exhaust manifold. I used stainless steel hose clamps to strap the aluminum to the manifold. Then, I strapped the stock pot to the aluminum channel. It sat there like a tumor on the side of the engine, but the contact patch was solid. The heat from the exhaust would transfer to the aluminum, then to the bottom of the stainless pot. Now, the plumbing. I connected one end of my copper coil to the brass fitting on the pot lid. The coil itself needed to be cooled. I did not have a pump to circulate cold lake water. I had to use ambient air. The tower was freezing. The air in the basement was 40 degrees. I ran the copper coil upward, stretching it out so the loops were spaced 2 inches apart. This increased air exposure. I ran the line up the wall, using zip ties to secure it to the existing conduit. At the top of the coil, the tube turned downward, terminating in a clean plastic jug I positioned on a lower shelf. The physics were simple. Fill pot with lake water, manually. Clamp lid. Run generator. Exhaust heats pot. Water boils. Steam rises into the copper tube. Cold air in the room cools the copper. Steam condenses back to water. Gravity pulls water down into the jug. The contaminant load, bacteria, viruses, heavy metals, would be left behind in the pot as sludge. The steam would be pure. But I needed water to start the cycle. I picked up the empty bucket. This was the part I had been dreading. I climbed the 80 feet to the gallery deck. The wind was still screaming, tearing at the zippers of my jacket. I clipped my safety harness to the railing. The lake was a churning gray chaos below. The waves were smashing the crib, sending spray 40 feet into the air. I had a coil of 3/8-inch nylon rope. I tied it to the bail of the bucket. I tied a loop in the other end and clipped it to the rail. I lowered the bucket. The wind caught it, blowing it sideways like a kite. It banged against the steel tower. Clang. Clang. I had to time the waves. I watched the rhythm. Swell. Swell. Breaker. Swell. Swell. Breaker. I waited for the breaker. As the white water surged up the side of the crib, I let the line run. The bucket dropped. It hit the crest of the wave. The water grabbed it with violent force, nearly jerking the rope from my hands. The nylon bit into my gloves. I hauled. My triceps burned. The bucket was heavy, swinging wildly, slamming against the rivets. I pulled it hand over hand, gasping the freezing air. When I got it over the rail, I was soaked in spray. The bucket was half full, maybe 2 gallons. It was murky, gray water with a film of foam on top. I looked at it. It looked like death. I carried it down to the basement. I poured the gray slush into my stainless steel boiler. I clamped the lid down. I tightened the 6 C-clamps until the gasket compressed. Now, the moment of truth. I checked the generator's oil. I primed the fuel lift pump. I flipped the battery selector to equalize. This would force the alternator to max output, putting a heavy load on the engine and generating maximum heat. I pressed the start button. The starter motor whined. Ree, and then the diesel caught. Chug, 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 chug. The sound was deafening in the concrete box. The engine settled into a hard, rhythmic idle. The smell of unburned diesel vanished, replaced by the hot, dry smell of iron heating up. I watched the temperature gauge on the control panel. 120 degrees free. 140 degrees free. 180 degrees Fahrenheit. I moved to the boiler. I put my hand near the exhaust manifold. It was radiating intense heat. The aluminum transfer plate was ticking as it expanded. The bottom of the stock pot was getting hot. I sat on the floor, watching the clear plastic tube at the end of my copper coil. 10 minutes passed. 20. The generator roared. The vibration rattled the tools on the bench. Then, I saw it. Condensation forming inside the copper loops. Tiny beads of moisture. They grew larger. They coalesced. A trickle started to run down the spiral. Drip. A single drop of clear liquid fell into the plastic jug. Drip. 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 It was not a stream. It was a slow, rhythmic production. maybe a cup an hour. But it was clear. I waited until there was an inch of water in the bottom of the jug. I killed the generator. The sudden silence was heavy. I unscrewed the cap of the jug. I smelled the water. It smelled like nothing. No algae, no diesel, no rot. I took a sip. It was flat, hot, and tasted faintly of copper. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. I had a machine that turned poison into life. As long as I had diesel, I had water. The thermal envelope, water, was solved. Heat was next. The tower was a heat sink. The brick and steel sucked thermal energy out of the air and radiated it into the wind. The watchroom, where I slept, was hovering around 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Survivable, but draining. Every calorie my body burned to stay warm was a calorie of food I did not have. I could not heat the whole tower. I needed to shrink my world. I went up to the watchroom. The equipment cabinets formed a rough U shape against one wall. I decided to turn that U into a fortress. I brought up the cardboard boxes from the MREs and the spare parts in the basement. I flattened them. Cardboard is an excellent insulator, trapped air pockets between paper layers. I taped the cardboard to the steel grating floor in the center of the cabinets, 2 layers thick. This stopped the cold draft rising from the battery room below. Next, I raided the cleaning locker. I found a heavy canvas drop cloth, stiff with old paint. I rigged a suspension line using paracord tied between the tops of the cabinets. I draped the canvas over the line, creating a tent that enclosed the space between the electronics racks. Inside this tent, the volume of air was small, maybe 60 cubic feet. The electronics cabinets themselves vented warm air, waste heat from the inverters and transformers. I used duct tape and cardboard to fashion scoops that directed this warm vent air into my canvas tent. I crawled inside. It was dark, smelling of canvas and warm circuit boards. I checked the thermometer on my zipper pull. Outside the tent, 44 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the tent, 58 degrees Fahrenheit. It was not luxury, but 14 degrees was the difference between shivering and sleeping. I laid down on my wool blankets inside the tent. I had secured the intake. I had a water maker. I had a thermal shelter. My stomach cramped. Hunger. Real hunger. Sharp and twisting. I opened the box of MREs. I pulled out a brown pouch. Menu 4. Pork sausage with gravy. I tore the top off. I ate it cold, squeezing the paste into my mouth. It tasted like salt and preservatives. I licked the inside of the wrapper. I had solved the immediate physics. But as I lay there, listening to the generator cool down in the basement 80 feet below, I realized the math was still against me. 2,000 gallons of fuel, 12 MREs, 1 man. The fuel would last a year. The food would last a week. I needed to fish. I closed my eyes. The image of the mink hitting the wall replayed in my mind. The way it had hissed. The desperation. I was the mink now. I was just hiding in a better hole. A deep thud shook the tower, louder than the waves. I sat up, hitting my head on the canvas. Another thud. Metal on concrete. It was not a wave. It was a collision. I scrambled out of my tent, grabbed my flashlight, and ran to the porthole. I could not see the base of the crib from the watchroom. I had to go to the lantern deck. I climbed the final flight of stairs to the glass room. The beacon flashed, illuminating the swirling snow. I pressed my face to the glass, looking straight down. Something was tangled in the ladder at the base of the crib. A boat. Not my boat. A larger vessel. A cabin cruiser, maybe 40 feet. It was smashed against the concrete apron, rising and falling with the swell. The hull was breached, fiberglass grinding against the iron ladder. The beacon swept over it. Flash. I saw the deck. Flash. I saw the movement. There were people on the deck, 3 of them. They were huddled against the cabin, clinging to the railing as the waves washed over them. They were not moving like the infected. They were bracing. They were looking up. One of them saw the light of the beacon. He raised an arm. A wave hit him, slamming him into the bulkhead, but he held on. He pointed up at me. I stepped back from the glass. Survivors. Variables. Threats. If I let them in, I split my 12 meals by 4. If I let them in, I introduced unknown vectors of infection. If I did not let them in, the lake would kill them in 10 minutes. I looked at the water maker I had just built. It produced 1 cup an hour. It could not support 4 people. I stood in the flashing light, my hand resting on the cold glass. The engineering phase was over. The moral calculus had begun. And unlike the copper tubing, I could not bend this problem with a torch. I watched the boat smash against the crib again. Crunch! The hull was disintegrating. I turned and looked at the door to the external gallery. I grabbed my cheater bar. I was not a hero. I was a technician. But a technician fixes things that are broken. And those people down there were definitely broken. I started down the stairs. The rhythm of my boots was faster this time. Clang, 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 clang. I did not know what I was going to do until I reached the bottom door. I put my hand on the wheel. I paused. Then I spun it. The dogs retracted. I pushed the steel door open into the storm. The door to the outside world did not open. It exploded inward. The pressure differential between the tower's interior and the storm ripped the steel handle from my grip, slamming the heavy plate against the stop with a concussive boom that rattled the conduit on the walls. I stepped out onto the concrete apron. Stepped is the wrong word. I leaned into a 40-knot crosswind that felt like a solid object. The sleet was horizontal, hitting my exposed skin like birdshot. My safety line, a static 11mm rope clipped to the interior handrail, snapped taut instantly. Below me, the lake was a churning slaughterhouse of gray water and white foam. The cabin cruiser was disintegrating. It was a 40-foot Sea Ray, a pleasure craft made of fiberglass and optimism, now being ground to paste against the unforgiving iron of the crib's base. Crunch! The hull lifted on a swell and slammed down on the submerged iron ladder. The sound was the shriek of tearing laminate. I looked down. The deck of the boat was pitching 40 degrees wildly. 3 figures clung to the stainless steel bow rail. They were soaked. Dark shapes against the white fiberglass. "Catch!" I screamed, but the wind tore the word away before it left my mouth. I did not have a winch. I did not have a helper. I had physics. I uncoiled the heavy 3/4-inch hawser I had grabbed from the maintenance locker. I quickly tied a bowline knot in the end, forming a loop large enough for a torso. My fingers were stiff, fumbling with the thick nylon, but muscle memory took over. Rabbit comes out of the hole, around the tree, back in the hole. I threw the line. The wind caught it, blowing it back toward the tower. Failed attempt. I hauled it back, cursing. I stripped off a heavy steel shackle from my belt, a 1-pound galvanized weight, and clipped it to the loop to give it mass. I threw again. The line arced down, heavy and true, landing across the shattered windshield of the boat. One of the figures, the one I had seen pointing earlier, scrambled for it. He was big, moving with the desperate, jerky energy of hypothermia. He did not put the loop around himself. He wrestled it around the figure slumped on the deck, the smaller one. He waved his arm. "Haul!" I wrapped the rope around the iron railing of the lighthouse gallery, creating a friction brake, a munter hitch. It would let me hold the weight without burning my hands to the bone. "Climb!" I yelled, though he could not hear me. The boat heaved up on a wave, rising 10 feet in a second. That was my window. I hauled on the slack, taking up the line. The boat dropped into the trough, but the rope went taut. The figure in the loop was yanked off the deck, dangling in the air, spinning in the spray. I pulled. It was dead weight, 150 pounds, maybe more with the wet clothes. My boots slipped on the icy concrete. I dropped my center of gravity, locking my knees, using my skeleton instead of my muscles. Heave, lock, heave, lock. The bundle cleared the edge of the apron. I grabbed the back of a soaked heavy jacket and dragged the person onto the concrete. It was a woman. She was barely conscious, her lips blue, eyes rolled back. I did not have time to check her vitals. The boat was breaking up. I threw the line back down. The big man grabbed it. He did not wait for the boat to rise. He tied the loop around his own waist. Then he grabbed the third figure, an older man who looked like a heap of wet laundry, and bear-hugged him. "Two at once?" "No," I shouted. "Idiot!" The physics were all wrong. 2 bodies meant 350 pounds. Wet, fighting gravity and wind. The boat smashed against the crib again. The bow rail sheared off. The man jumped. The rope snapped taut. The shock load nearly pulled me over the railing. The iron pipe bit into my ribs. The friction hitch smoked, the nylon melting slightly as it slipped. They slammed into the side of the crib. I heard the wet thud of flesh hitting concrete. I leaned back, screaming with effort, my boots scrabbling for traction on the verglas. I was not lifting them. I was just keeping them from falling back into the crushing water. I needed mechanical advantage. I looked around. No pulleys, no winch. I saw the door frame. I looped the slack end of the rope around the heavy steel hinge of the storm door. I used it as a capstan. I spun the rope, taking a turn. Now, as I pulled, the friction of the hinge held the weight. I pulled. 6 inches. I pulled. Another foot. My hands were raw inside my gloves. My shoulders felt like the sockets were tearing. A hand slapped onto the edge of the concrete apron. Then another. The big man was climbing, dragging the dead weight of the older man with him. He kicked against the vertical wall, grunting with a primal, animalistic sound. I grabbed his collar. I hauled. They tumbled over the lip of the concrete, a tangled mass of limbs and freezing water. I did not celebrate. I did not ask if they were okay. I unclipped my safety line, grabbed the collar of the woman's jacket with one hand and the older man's belt with the other, and dragged them toward the open door. "Inside! Move!" I kicked the big man in the thigh. He stumbled up and staggered into the entryway. I shoved the others in, jumped across the threshold, and slammed the steel door. I spun the wheel. The dog shrieked into place. The silence was sudden and deafening. We were inside the base of the tower. The air was cold, but it was still. It smelled of diesel and wet wool. I stood with my back against the door, chest heaving, the cheater bar gripped in my right hand. I clicked my headlamp to high beam. "Stay down," I rasped. "Do not move." The 3 survivors were a heap on the metal grating. Survivor 1, the big man. Maybe 40 years old, wearing a blurred tactical vest over a hunting jacket. He was shivering so hard his teeth were clicking audibly. Clack, clack, clack. He had a gash on his forehead that was bleeding freely, the blood mixing with the lake water on his face. Survivor 2, the woman. Young, 20-somethings, expensive ski jacket. She was curled in a fetal ball, shaking violently. Her eyes were open but unfocused. Survivor 3, the older man. 60+, gray beard. He was not shivering. That was bad. I moved to the older man. I kept the cheater bar raised. I prodded his leg with the steel toe of my boot. Hey, no response. I knelt, keeping my distance. I checked for chest rise. Nothing. I reached out and touched his neck. Ice cold. No pulse. I looked closer at his neck. There was a wound. Not a scrape from the fall. A tear. Ragged, semicircular. The flesh around it was gray and puckered, not bleeding. A bite. My stomach dropped. I scrambled back, raising the bar. He's dead, I shouted at the big man. He's bit. The big man looked up. His eyes were glassy. My dad, he stuttered. Just cold. He's just cold. Look at his neck. No, slipped. He slipped on the dock. I did not argue. The virus, or whatever it was, did not care about denial. I had seen the mink. I knew how fast the transition happened. If the cold had preserved the virus, reanimation could be delayed, or it could be instantaneous upon rewarming. I had to separate them. Now. Get up, I ordered the big man. He tried, but his legs failed him. He collapsed. Hypothermia, stage 2, loss of motor control. I had a dead man with a bite wound and 2 people dying of cold in my airlock. If I let them die, I was a monster. If I let them live, I risked everything. I made a choice. I grabbed the dead man by the ankles. I'm moving him to the battery room. You 2, stay here. I dragged the body across the grating. I opened the door to the battery backup room, a small concrete cell housing racks of lead-acid cells. It had a heavy steel door. I pulled the body inside. I did a quick search of his pockets. A wallet, a set of keys, a folding knife. I took the knife. I stepped out and slammed the door. I locked it. Then I took a length of 12-gauge solid copper wire from my tool bag and twisted it through the padlock hasp, securing it. It was not a lock, but it would hold against a corpse. Now, the living. They were in the umbles, stumbles, mumbles, fumbles. They needed heat immediately, but I could not bring them to the watchroom. That was my clean zone. I looked at the generator room. It was warm. The engine block was a massive thermal radiator. Let's go, I said. I half-carried, half-dragged the woman down the hatch to the basement. I set her against the wall near the engine, but not touching it. I went back for the big man. He was heavier, dead weight. I fireman carried him down the narrow stairs, my knees protesting under the load. I dropped him next to the woman. Clothes off, I said. Wet layers kill you. They stared at me blankly. I did not have time for modesty. I pulled the knife I had taken from the dead man, a buck 110. I cut the woman's jacket up the front. I cut the thermal shirt. I stripped the wet denim. Her skin was marble white, cold to the touch. I did the same for the man. Under his tactical vest, he had a flannel shirt and a pistol in a shoulder holster, a Glock 17. I stopped. I took the gun. I ejected the magazine. Full. I checked the chamber. Loaded. I put the gun in my waistband at the small of my back. Then I finished stripping him. I grabbed the dry wool blankets from the emergency locker. I wrapped them tightly, burying them in the scratchy fabric. Drink. I held my plastic jug of distilled water to the woman's lips. Small sips. Do not vomit. She swallowed. She coughed, then swallowed again. I moved to the man. He drank greedily. "Who are you?" he whispered. "The janitor," I said. "Sit tight. I have to check the hull." I left them in the basement with the thrumming diesel engine and climbed back to the entry level. I went to the battery room door. I listened. Silence. I checked the wire twist. Secure. I went up to the lantern room. I needed to see the damage. The storm was raging, but the boat was gone, smashed to pieces and swallowed by the lake. But the impact. I shone my light down the side of the crib. The concrete was chipped, but the crib was solid. It was built to withstand ice flows. A fiberglass boat was nothing. However, the ladder was mangled, twisted steel rebar hanging by a thread. That was my secondary escape route. Gone. I went back down to the watchroom. I sat on my crate. I had a gun now, a Glock 17. I had never fired a handgun. I knew the mechanics, slide, striker, sear, but I did not have the muscle memory. I looked at the gun. It was a tool, a high-velocity hole punch. I put it on the shelf next to my multimeter. I went back down to the basement. The survivors were stabilizing. The shivering had changed from the violent convulsions of stage 2 to the high-frequency tremors of recovery. That was good. The woman was looking around. She saw the copper coil set up on the engine. "Is that a still?" she asked. Her voice was raspy. "Flash boiler," I corrected. "Do not touch the copper. It's 300 degrees. "My name is Sarah," she said. "That's Jim." The man upstairs was Arthur. "Elias," I said. Arthur was bitten. The room went quiet. The generator chugged. Chug, chug, chug. Jim sat up, pulling the blanket tighter. He was not turned. He was just hurt. "He had a necrotic wound on his jugular," I said, keeping my voice flat. "I'm not debating biology with you. He's in the battery room. If he wakes up, he stays there. If he does not, we throw him in the lake tomorrow." Jim glared at me, but he did not move. He saw the bulge of the Glock in my waistband. He saw the way I held the wrench. "We need food," Jim said. "We have not eaten in 2 days." "I have 10 MREs, I said. "For 1 person. Now for 3. That's 3 days of food." "There were supplies on the boat," Sarah said. "Canned goods. A shotgun." "The boat is splinters," I said. "It's gone." Sarah closed her eyes. A tear leaked out. "Listen," I said. "You're alive. You're warm. You have water. That's more than 99% of the population right now. Stop crying. It dehydrates you." I was being harsh. I knew it. But soft comfort kills people in survival situations. They needed to be scared, and they needed to be obedient. "Jim," I said, "what did you do before?" "Contractor," he grunted. "Drywall and framing." "Good. You know how to use tools." "Sarah?" "Medical student, 3rd year." I paused. That was an asset. A massive asset. "Okay," I said. "Sarah, you're the medic. Monitor him. Check his extremities for frostbite. If his toes turn black, tell me. We do not have antibiotics for gangrene. I turned to go back upstairs. Wait, Jim said. The gun. That's mine. It was yours, I said. Now it's station equipment. You get it back if I decide you are not going to shoot me for a can of beans. I climbed the stairs. I stopped at the battery room door again. Thump. Soft, like a bag of wet sand hitting the door. I froze. Thump. Scritch. The sound of fabric rubbing against steel. Arthur was awake. I stepped closer. I could hear breathing. Not the rhythmic breathing of sleep. A wet, gurgling aspiration. Glug. Glug. He was scratching at the door. Not pounding, just feeling it. I looked at the wire I had twisted through the hasp. It was 12-gauge copper. Soft, malleable. If he threw his weight against the door, the hasp might hold, but the copper would shear. I needed a padlock. I did not have a padlock. I ran up to the watchroom. I dug through my tool bag. I found a bolt, a half-inch stainless steel carriage bolt with a nut and a washer. I ran back down. As I reached the landing, the door shook. Bam! He knew I was there. He could smell me, or hear me. Bam! The copper wire stretched. The door opened a crack, maybe half an inch. I saw an eye. It was not a human eye anymore. The pupil was blown wide, the iris hemorrhaged to a muddy red. The skin around it was gray and sloughing off like wet paper. Arthur, I whispered. A hand shot through the gap. It was not reaching, it was clawing. The fingers were broken, bent at impossible angles, but they hooked the door frame with terrified strength. He was trying to pull the door open. I did not think. I swung the cheater bar. I aimed for the fingers. Crack! I shattered the hand. Bone fragments sprayed. He did not scream. He did not recoil. The hand just went limp, hanging there like a ragged glove, but the body behind the door kept pushing. Bam! Bam! The copper wire snapped. The door swung open. Arthur stood there. He was massive. Even in death, his frame filled the doorway. His jaw hung loose, the bite on his neck pulsating with black ichor. He lunged. I stepped back, slipping on the grating. I fell hard on my ass. He fell on top of me. He was heavy. So heavy. And cold. He smelled of lake water and rotten meat. His teeth snapped inches from my face. Click, click, click. I jammed the cheater bar across his throat, pushing up. His weight was crushing me. My arms trembled. "Jim!" I screamed. "Jim!" Arthur's drool dripped onto my face. It burned like acid. I pushed. I could not hold him. He was stronger than a living man. He had no inhibition, no pain response. He was just a biological hydraulic press. I reached for the gun in my waistband. I could not reach it. He was pinning my hips. My hand scrabbled on the floor. I felt something metal. The bolt. The carriage bolt I had dropped. Useless. I felt the flashlight. I grabbed it. A heavy aluminum LED torch. I swung it in a short arc, hammering it into the side of his skull. Thud. Nothing. Thud. Nothing. He leaned down, his mouth opening wide, ready to tear my throat out. Then a shape blocked the light. A steel pipe slammed into the back of Arthur's head. Crunch. It was a wet, hollow sound, like smashing a pumpkin. Arthur went limp instantly. His weight became dead weight again. I shoved him off, scrambling backward, retching. Jim stood there. He was wrapped in the wool blanket, shivering, holding a length of galvanized pipe he had ripped from the conduit run on the wall. He looked down at his father. The back of Arthur's skull was caved in. Dark matter pooled on the grating. Jim did not cry. He did not look horrified. He looked empty. "He was already dead," Jim said. His voice was devoid of inflection. "You said he was dead." I stood up. I wiped the slime off my face. My hands were shaking so hard I dropped the flashlight. "He was," I said. "He was." Sarah appeared at the top of the basement stairs. She saw the body. She put a hand over her mouth, stifling a scream. I looked at the mess, the blood, the infection risk. "We need bleach," I said. My voice sounded frantic to my own ears. "We need to clean this, now, before it dries." I looked at Jim. He was still holding the pipe. "Thank you," I said. Jim nodded slowly. He dropped the pipe. It rang against the steel floor. "He taught me how to swing a hammer," Jim whispered. "That's the only reason I could do it." I looked at the open door of the battery room. The vulnerability. I had almost died because I used copper wire instead of a bolt. Because I hesitated. I walked over to the corpse. I grabbed the ankles. "Help me," I said to Jim. "We're putting him in the lake." "Now?" "Right now, before the rigor sets in, before the smell." We dragged the body to the entry door. I opened the wheel. The storm was still raging, but it felt less violent than the violence inside the tower. We pushed Arthur onto the icy apron. I used my boot to shove him to the edge. Gravity took him. He splashed into the dark water and was gone. I closed the door. I spun the wheel. I leaned my forehead against the cold steel. "We need a system," I said. "New rules." I turned to face them. I was covered in filth. I held the Glock in my hand now, checking the safety. "Nobody moves alone," I said. "Nobody opens a door without announcing it. And every scratch, every cut, every bruise gets reported to Sarah immediately." I looked at Sarah. "You're the doctor," I said. "You check us every morning. Naked check. No exceptions." She nodded, pale but resolute. "And Jim," I said. He looked up. "You're the security," I said. "I cannot watch the door and fix the machines. You watch the door." I handed him the cheater bar. I kept the gun. "What do you do?" Jim asked. "I keep the light on," I said. "And I figure out how we do not starve to death." I walked past them, up the spiral stairs. I needed to wash my face. I needed to restart the water maker. The crisis had not ended. It had just changed. The tower was not empty anymore. It was a colony. And colonies have politics. I reached the watchroom. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of a cabinet. There was black blood on my cheek. I wiped it off. I looked at the 7 screws I had saved on the cabinet top. I added the carriage bolt to the row. Assets. I sat down and listened to the wind. The tower groaned. We were alive for one more night. Time on the tower stopped being measured in hours or minutes. It dissolved into a binary rhythm. The light on, the light off. The generator running, the generator resting. The hunger and the eating. We had become components of the machine we inhabited.
I woke to the sound of Sarah coughing. It was a dry, hacking sound that rattled in her chest, amplified by the canvas walls of the thermal tent we all shared.
The air inside our enclosure was thick, humid, and smelled of unwashed bodies, recycled breath, and the metallic tang of vitamin deficiency. I rolled over on the hard steel grating. My hip bones ground against the floor. I had lost 20 pounds in 6 weeks. Jim had lost 30. We were stripping weight like racing engines, burning our own chassis to keep the motor running. "Vitals," Sarah whispered. It was the morning ritual. I sat up, the wool blanket falling off my shoulders. The air outside the tent was 30 degrees. Inside, it was 52. I unzipped the canvas flap. Jim was already up, sitting on a bucket near the battery rack, staring at the voltage meter. He looked like a caveman wearing tactical gear. His beard was a thick, matted spade of black hair, and his eyes were sunken deep into his skull. "Voltage?" I asked. 25.4, Jim grunted. "Batteries are holding charge better since we lowered the beacon duty cycle." I nodded. I had reprogrammed the VRB25 LED beacon. Instead of the standard 0.6 second flash every 6 seconds, I had dialed it down to a 0.1 second pulse every 10. It was barely a blink, a navigational stutter, but it saved 4 amp-hours a night. Sarah crawled out of the tent. She was pale, her skin translucent in the harsh light of my headlamp. She held a small notebook. "Elias, shirt off." I did not argue. Modesty had died in the first week. I pulled my layers up. She ran her cold hands over my torso, checking for petechia, small red spots that indicate scurvy or blood infection. She pressed her fingers into my ankles, checking for edema. "Gums?" she asked. I bared my teeth. They felt loose. "Inflamed," she noted, writing it down. "We need vitamin C. The spruce tips did not work." We had tried boiling the few needles that had blown onto the gallery deck during a storm. It was a desperate tea that tasted like turpentine and delivered nothing. "Jim, you're next." This was our life. We were a closed loop. The MREs had run out on day 5. We had stretched them to day 9 by licking the wrappers and boiling the residual sauce into a soup. Since then, we had survived on what I called the harvest. It was an engineering solution to a biological problem. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, the workbench in the basement. The smell here was overpowering. Fish guts and diesel. I checked the drying rack. Suspended above the generator's exhaust manifold, hanging on copper wires, were strips of dark, leathery meat. Burbot. Lota. The freshwater lingcod. They are ugly bottom feeders, slimy and serpentine, but their livers are massive and rich in vitamin A and D. They were the only reason we were not dead. I put on my gloves. "Rig check," I said. Jim stood up. "I'll crank." We walked out to the gallery deck. The winter had cemented the tower in a casing of ice. The railing was a foot thick with white rime. The lake below was a frozen, chaotic plain, pack ice that ground and shrieked as the currents moved it, with narrow leads of black water opening and closing like fissures in the earth. I had built the gantry on the south side, sheltered from the prevailing wind. It was a cantilever system constructed from a 10-foot section of unistrut channel I had scavenged from the cable trays. I had bolted it to the tower railing, projecting it 8 feet out over the abyss. At the end, I had mounted a pulley made from a heavy-duty caster wheel, its rubber tire removed to expose the steel hub. The line was the masterpiece. I did not have fishing line. I had wire. I had stripped 1,000 feet of 14-gauge THHN building wire from the defunct conduits in the tower.
I twisted 3 strands together using a drill to create a braided cable with a tensile strength of over 400 pounds. At the bottom of the line, 80 feet down, was the spreader bar, a piece of rebar weighted with a 20-pound chunk of concrete. Hanging from the bar were 6 leaders made of thinner steel wire. The hooks were sharpened screws, heated red-hot and bent with pliers, then filed to a needle point. "Haul it," I said. Jim grabbed the handle of the winch. The winch was the steering column mechanism from the wrecked Sea Ray, which we had salvaged from the rocks before the ice took it. Click-clack, click-clack.
The ratchet gear sang in the cold air. Jim's back muscles corded under his shirt. He was lifting 50 pounds of dead weight plus the drag of the current. I watched the black water far below. The line vibrated. "Heavy?" I asked. "Dead weight," Jim grunted. "Maybe ice." The spreader bar broke the surface of the water, 80 feet down. I squinted. "Movement," I said. "Keep cranking. Steady." If he cranked too fast, the hooks would tear out. Too slow, and the fish would thrash off. The bar rose past the 50-foot mark, past the 30. I leaned over the rail with the gaff, a long pole with a sharpened screwdriver duct taped to the end. The bar cleared the rail. 3 fish, 2 burbot wrapping their slimy tails around the wire, and 1 lake trout frozen in a curve. "Jackpot," Jim breathed. He locked the winch. I swung the gantry arm inward. I unhooked the fish, throwing them into a plastic tote. The trout was a prize, fatty flesh. The burbot were survival fuel. "Reset," I said. We baited the hooks. We did not have worms. We used the flash lures, strips of the MRE foil packets glued to the backs of stainless steel washers. When jigged, they fluttered in the dark water. The fish struck out of aggression, not hunger. I lowered the rig back into the dark lead between the ice sheets. We had food for another 2 days. January broke us, but February rebuilt us as something else. The mainland fires had gone out weeks ago. There was nothing left to burn, or the snow had buried it. The horizon was a flat, white void. We saw no headlights on the highway 20 miles away. We heard no radio traffic. The silence was absolute. A heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed against the steel walls. We developed a language of minimal effort. Tank meant check the fuel level. Filter meant the water maker flow is slowing down. Watch meant it's your turn to scan the horizon. We stopped talking about the past. The past was a painful luxury. Sarah stopped mentioning her residency or her fiancé. Jim stopped talking about his dad. I stopped thinking about the promotion I was supposed to get in November. We were the monks of the Order of the Diesel. Our hierarchy was rigid. I was the prime mover. I understood the systems. If I said, turn off the heater, we froze, because the alternative was running out of fuel in March. Sarah was the steward. She managed the biological assets. She rationed the dried fish. She cleaned the latrine bucket, a joint compound bucket we emptied off the lee side daily. She decided who was strong enough to work. Jim was the kinetic. He was the force. He cranked the winch. He broke the ice off the intake vents. He carried the water jugs. One night, deep in February, the wind died. The sudden silence woke me up. I climbed out of the tent. I went up to the lantern room. The sky was clear. The Milky Way was a jagged scar of diamond dust across the black vault. Without the light pollution from Marquette, the stars were terrifyingly bright. Jim was there, sitting on the floor, looking out the glass.
The Glock 17 was on the floor beside him. "You okay?" I asked. He did not look at me. "I counted the rounds today. 17 in the mag, 1 in the pipe, 18. And? Divisible by 3, he said. 6 each." I sat down next to him. The cold radiating from the glass was intense. "We are not there yet, Jim." "Are not we?" He gestured to the white void below. "The ice is 5 feet thick. We cannot leave. Nobody is coming. We're just eating raw fish and waiting for the fuel to run out." "The fuel lasts until August at this burn rate," I said. "And then?" "Then we have wind," I said. "I've been drawing plans. We can strip the alternator from the generator, mounted to a vertical axis turbine made from the Sea Ray's hull panels. We can generate power." Jim laughed. It was a dry, cracking sound. "You think you can engineer your way out of the apocalypse?" "I know I can," I said. "Because the alternative is using that math of yours. And I do not like division." He picked up the gun. I tensed. He ejected the magazine, racked the slide to clear the chamber, and handed me the weapon. "Take it," he said. "I'm thinking about it too much."
I took the cold polymer frame. "Go sleep, Jim. You're on winch duty at 0600. He nodded and went downstairs. I sat there for an hour, holding the empty gun. I looked at the beacon. Flash. Dark. Flash. Dark. It did not care if we lived or died. It just did its job. That was the only morality left. Competence. Function. Spring did not arrive with warmth. It arrived with violence. In late March, the wind shifted to the southwest. The temperature spiked to 35 degrees for 2 days. The ice sheet on the lake began to break. It sounded like artillery. Crack! Boom! Massive plates of ice, miles wide, were driven by the wind against the crib. They piled up, shoving over each other, creating shards of blue-white ice the size of houses. The tower shook. Not the vibration of the wind. This was a seismic shudder. The crib was being assaulted by millions of tons of momentum. I was in the basement, monitoring the water maker. The copper coil was rattling against the engine block. "Elias!" Sarah shouted from the stairs. "The apron!" I ran up. We crowded the porthole in the entry level. The ice was climbing the tower. A pressure ridge had formed against the north face. Slabs of ice were being forced up the side of the concrete crib, grinding over the railing, piling up against the steel door. "It's going to crush the door," Jim said. "No," I said. "The door opens inward." But if it piles too high, it'll bury the intake vent. The vent, my steel grate modification. If the ice covered it, the generator would starve for air. It would stall. "We have to clear it," I said. "Outside?" Sarah asked. "In that?" "If the engine dies, the water stops," I said. I grabbed the crowbar. Jim grabbed the shovel. "Harnesses," I ordered. "Double lines." We opened the door. The noise was deafening. The grinding of the ice was a physical scream. We stepped out onto the gallery. The ice pile was already 4 feet high, a chaotic ramp of jagged blocks threatening to spill over the railing and crush the vent hood. "Dig!" I yelled. We attacked the ice. I slammed the crowbar into the blocks, shattering them. Jim shoveled the debris over the side, back into the churning water below. The wind was throwing spray that froze instantly on our goggles. I could not feel my hands. I was a robot, driven by the fear of silence.
If the engine stopped, we died. A massive slab, maybe 500 pounds, shifted above us. "Watch out!" Jim slammed his shoulder into me, knocking me sideways. The slab crashed down, hitting the spot where I had been standing. It glanced off Jim's leg. He roared, but did not fall. "Keep digging!" he screamed. We worked for 2 hours. We cleared a pocket around the vent. The engine exhaust chugged rhythmically, a black defiance against the white chaos.
When we finally fell back inside the tower and dogged the door, we were encased in ice. Our clothes were stiff shells. Sarah was there with warm water, precious, distilled water heated on the manifold. "Drink," she ordered. We drank. Jim sat on the floor, rubbing his bruised leg. He looked at me. His face was gray, but his eyes were bright. "We beat it," he said. "For today," I said. "No," he said. "We beat the winter. Look," he pointed to the porthole. Through the shifting ice, through the gray storm, a beam of sunlight had punched through the clouds. It hit the water a mile out. The water was not black. It was blue. A deep, cold, impossible blue. By May, the ice was gone. The lake was a vast, breathing expanse of open water. We opened the gallery door and left it open. The air was crisp, smelling of ozone and pine resin blowing from the distant, empty land. We had survived. But survival had changed the definition of who we were. I stood on the lantern deck, looking through the high-powered binoculars. I scanned the coastline of Marquette. The smoke was gone. The buildings were there, small gray shapes, but there was no movement. No boats, no cars, no smokestacks. Nature was reclaiming it. I could see the green haze of new growth swallowing the highways. "Anything?" Sarah asked. She was standing beside me, leaning on the rail. She looked healthier now. The fishing had been good in the spring run. Her hair was tied back with a piece of copper wire. "Nothing," I said. "No signals." "We could take the raft," she said. We had built a raft. It was a crude thing, made from the empty diesel drums, once we burned through them, and the unistrut gantry. It could float. It could get us to shore. "And go where?" I asked. She looked at the green line of the shore. "To find people. The people who are left are the ones who survived," I said. "Think about what they had to do to survive down there. We had a tower. They had competition." I thought about the gun with 18 rounds. I thought about the peace of the machine. "We stay," Jim said. He climbed up the stairs, carrying a fresh tray of smoked trout. "The garden is coming in." He had built planter boxes on the gallery deck using the plastic totes and sludge from the bottom of the lake, dredged up with the winch, mixed with our own compost. He was growing wild onions and dandelions he had found seeds for in the pockets of the dead man's coat. It was not much, but it was green. "We stay," I agreed. I looked at the VRB-25 beacon. The motor was humming. The bearing was smooth. I was the systems engineer. This was my system. I walked over to the logbook, a paper notebook I had started on day 1. Day 184. Fuel, 1,420 gallons. Volts, 26.2. Weather, clear. Wind southwest, 10 knots. Status, operational. I closed the book. The world had turned loud and died. But up here, amidst the steel and the wind, we had built a quiet, humming order. I looked at Sarah and Jim. They were not strangers. They were not friends.
They were crew. "Filter check in 10 minutes, I said. "Copy," Jim said. "On it," Sarah said. I turned back to the window and watched the sun set over the empty, beautiful world. The light flashed. Flash. We were still here.